Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here, and this week we are welcoming back Dr. Adryon Burton Denmark. And as I mentioned last week, this is Dr. Mark Burton's daughter, and she was also on with us last year when we talked about suicide. And so she's joining us again, and she did her dissertation for her PhD on suicide, and she did it on a pretty specific subgroup, but I feel like it's pertinent to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so tonight we're going to be talking about adolescent suicide. And so I'm calling it adolescent suicide as opposed to teen suicide because there are kids and correct me if I'm wrong here, as young as like 9 or 10 who are attempting or even completing suicide.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about your background and just briefly about this dissertation that you did.
Sure. Yeah. So that population was college students.
Mm-hmm.
But often when you're a suicide researcher, you are looking at those age groups differently, but you see a lot of similarities.
Right.
So in my research about college students, certainly a lot came up about adolescents and some of the ways that those, groups have similar suicide rates because they're young and healthy people.
Yes.
And they don't die for a lot of other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about adolescent suicide, you are talking about something that is statistically very rare. However, it's also the leading cause of death among this age group in Utah, right?
Yes.
That's not true everywhere. Other leading causes of death like car accidents,
Right.
So accidents, homicides, and death by suicide are, typically the three kind of leading cause of death for this young and healthy population. And so for adolescents in Utah, it's number one. So that's a serious problem, even if you're talking about a low incidence event.
Yes.
But tonight, you and I will be talking about, not just when people have died by suicide, but the whole phenomenon around it, the far greater proportion of the adolescent population that considers suicide seriously and maybe engages in other suicide adjacent behaviors, self-injury that may or may not have suicidal desire or intent linked with it, or suicide attempts.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Tell me also about your current work among teens. So you work with your dad in a practice in Aspen Grove Counseling. And it's my understanding that primarily you are working with teens. Is that correct?
I treat a lot of adolescents. It wasn't a primary focus when I started my practice. What actually happened is that I would see just as many teens as there were after school hours available to me.
Okay.
Then during the pandemic, specifically when they were all staying home, my practice shifted to about half teens because they could see me all day, every day.
Yep.
They're home from school and we're meeting by Zoom. It is now that everyone's back in school, again, my practice has shifted such that I treat mostly adults during the day and then adolescents after school. So it's not the majority population that I treat anymore.
Okay.
But it's still a substantial part of my practice. And in fact, now I treat a lot more adolescents than I do college students. Mm-hmm. You were asking about my dissertation, and I think it will be relevant to this discussion because what we had done is asked a huge national sample of college students to tell us a lot of things. It was an anonymous survey. So things like whether they had seriously considered suicide in the past 12 months. And if they had, we asked them if they told anybody that they were thinking about that. Mm-hmm. And about half of them said they had not.
Oh, okay.
So then we asked those people, well, why didn't you tell anybody? And that was a text box where they could write in their answers. My dissertation was thematic content analysis of those answers. So that basically resulted in reasons why college students didn't tell anybody.
Okay, so let's talk about the rising rate of suicide among adolescents in America. And we're not going to talk too much about numbers and statistics because the main focus is going to be why and what we can do about it. So let's also lump in there the number of attempted suicides and the number of completed suicides. So what's that like right now in our country?
What we can call that, we can broadly call that suicidality.
Okay.
Right? That
Yeah.
kind of groups all this together. Now, of course, the easiest thing for experts to track, for researchers to track, is deaths by suicide.
Okay.
That's the easiest number because, you get coroner's reports.
Right.
And so when you look at that, intense index of the problem, you do see a decades-long increase. So there has been an increase, for example, in Utah, over the past 2 decades, most people are saying the rates have tripled.
Wow.
Yeah, so substantial. And that's been a trend nationwide as well. And, it is worth noting that Utah is one of the states with one of the highest adolescent suicide rates, maybe about 6 or so in the nation. It kind of changes, year by year, and depending on what year you're looking at the data. Utah, interestingly, also often ranks last in the nation in terms of access to mental health services. So I think those two things are very connected.
Yes. In my opinion, that has got to be the biggest failure of our healthcare system. I mean, going to a therapist or doing talk therapy should be even more readily accessible than antidepressants.
Yes.
And, most people know by now that Mark and I have some pretty strong opinions about antidepressants, particularly your dad. And he owns his bias in that. But I mean, it drives me so crazy that people don't try talk therapy either in conjunction or before. I mean, because there is so much more to mental health than just taking a pill. And I think people don't realize that. And I think it can also be very hard and terrifying as a parent to watch your child going through either depression or anxiety or, suicidality. That's terrifying. And you want to fix it. And for some reason, people have this bizarre idea that you can fix anything with a pill, and that's just not the case. And
True.
so, I mean, I think the biggest thing we could do in helping prevent suicide is better access to mental health care. That would go a long way, I think.
And so access is a big problem because a lot of people have been desperately seeking services for their teens. And it breaks my heart. A lot of what I do when I can't take people into my practice is, just serve as a contact point and help them get connected with other providers.
Yeah.
And, now I'm referring to sort of second and third degree providers because all my immediate, teen focused providers that I used to refer to, they're all full. Everybody's all full. We are in the middle of an intense crisis. So sort of a decades long trend of worsening adolescent mental health. And then you get this pandemic. Yeah. And I will tell you from my experience treating adults, teens, and children, the people who have not bounced back are the adolescents. Yeah. They are the ones, the adults we're coming out of the pandemic. We're doing okay again. It was really hard. We're on our feet. The adolescents took longer to feel the full effect of the pandemic, but they are the ones who are just not bouncing back. And so a lot of people are trying to get their teens connected and they don't have anywhere to send them. And treatment is expensive and insurance, networks are small and outdated and, coverage may not be very good. And so there is on parents' part a desperation, when they recognize that their teen is struggling and they're trying to get them connected with services. So that is definitely something that needs to happen is better access.
And this is something that my parents could probably relate to a little bit. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to share an experience I had as a teenager. So my senior year of high school, I fell into patterns of self-harm. And a lot of it related to guilt and shame surrounding a relationship that I was in. And my parents, they were wonderful people. They loved me. I had a very safe and secure home, but I didn't like my mom. We get along really well now. I mean, I love her. We talk all the time. We're really, really good friends. But in high school, I just didn't like her and I didn't want to talk to her and I didn't want to be around her. And she probably felt a little helpless watching me go through this period of kind of just withdrawal. I mean, she obviously knew me enough and was involved enough in my life to recognize that something was going on, but she couldn't do anything. And so she did the next best thing that she could do that I want to encourage all parents to do. She sought someone who she thought I would trust and I would talk to. And so she reached out to a leader from church that she knew I liked and was close to and asked for her help. And this church leader was a huge influence in my life at that time. I mean, she played a critical role. So, to all those parents out there who are struggling with their teenager, I get it to an extent, right? Having been a teenager who just didn't want to talk to her parents or who wasn't willing to open up to them, don't let that deter you and don't take it personal. I think that's another big thing is don't blame yourself. Don't, take on those emotions. Don't take on that guilt. Just find anyone who your teenager will talk to. Anyone, because that's really what they need is they just need someone to listen to them.
Yes. Yes. It does not need to be a trained professional. Although, if you're talking about like serious depression and persistent suicidality, professional help is very warranted.
Yes.
But often, not always, these crises are episodic for teens. They may be related to peer rejection. They may be related to romantic relationships.
Yeah.
And, it is worth noting that specifically for adolescents, it feels like what they're going through is going to be forever.
Yes.
Right? This moment is all there is. And, with their like undeveloped, not fully myelinated prefrontal cortex, right? That's the brain speak for like their brains haven't caught up yet. They're highly impulsive.
Yeah.
And so another thing you asked, like maybe why is the suicide rate in Utah so high? It's pretty high through like the Midwestern states and mountain states. It's high in places where there's a big rural population. It's high in places where there are access to firearms.
Okay.
And, so here's what you get when you look at teens. It's a pretty similar profile for adults, is you get a lot more adolescent girls reporting serious suicidal thoughts, reporting self-injury and things like that. But you get a lot more boys actually dying by suicide. And the difference is the methods they choose. And, the real difference is access to firearms. So in a very short answer, if you ask me what's the number one thing you can do to prevent adolescents from dying by suicide, it's make sure they do not have access to a gun.
Yes. This was something we spent a lot of time talking about last week with your dad. And we discussed, our primary discussion was the difference between men and women in their suicidality. And that was one of the things that we brought up was the fact that men are more likely to die by suicide than women, again, because of the use of firearms. And that was another thing that we definitely harped on is lock up your guns.
Exactly.
Or one of the things that your dad even went so far to suggest that I agreed with is if someone in your household is exhibiting signs of suicidality, get them out of the house, get the guns out of the house. It doesn't have to be forever, but just give them to a friend that you trust and say, I need you to hold on to these for a little bit while we're coping with this serious mental illness going on in our house. And so, I mean, it's something that you can't stress enough is locking them up. And one of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes, and I believe we talked about it last week too, was just the act of having to unlock a gun is often enough to slow them and to kind of curb that impulsivity that surrounds killing yourself via firearm, right?
Yeah.
And so locks are a great measure in helping prevent suicide.
Yes. I saw a statistic, and this was years back now, but of course it stuck with me, that an adolescent with a gun in the home is 75 times more likely to die by suicide than an adolescent, sort of equally matched who doesn't have a gun in the home, right? That's, so it's true for adults, but think how much more impulsive this group is that we're talking about.
Yep.
And so reducing access to means is the most important and effective thing people can do to prevent deaths. So if you're worried about someone in the home, other steps to take are like to lock up medications, things that could potentially be used in an overdose. So, so I think maybe that's all we need to say about deaths by suicide in terms of prevention, and maybe shift more into this topic about like why people are thinking about suicide so much. And, what's going on with the adolescent mental health crisis, aside from and including the pandemic, right? The pandemic just made a lot of things worse.
Right. So last year, when we talked about suicide prevention, you had mentioned a really interesting phenomenon where when something happens on a global scale or even like a national scale, like the pandemic, you also referenced 9/11, that initially suicide rates decrease because it creates this sense of community and kind of camaraderie. Like we're all going through this together. And then we see an increase in suicidality. And so I would imagine that a lot of it stems from isolation and hopelessness. Does that sound
Bingo.
correct? Yeah.
Yes. And that those things are exacerbated in this
Yes.
group, right?
Yes.
Isolation has been trending upward. The felt sense of isolation
Yes.
has been trending upward even before the pandemic
Okay.
because adolescents are really spending less time face to face with each other.
Yes.
They're spending more time online, more time connecting through social media, less time actually in person. Your brain doesn't respond to social media contact the way it responds to face-to-face contact or even sort of telephone, video contact, voice to voice, right?
Yeah.
Texting doesn't give your brain that sense of being held and seen by another. And so even though they're in constant contact, they're far more isolated. That's true of adolescents. It's true of adults too, but it's just more true of them. Increasing isolation, increasing hopelessness, because they also have access to all the news, right?
Yes. Yep.
All the news is coming at them all the time. And a lot of it is pretty bleak for their future, right? The adolescents I see are very, very concerned about climate change and whether they're going to have a world to live in with air they can breathe and water they can drink with good reason, right? Like they're worried about this. They aren't wrapped up in this bubble. They know everything that's going on. And then from the camaraderie of the early days of the pandemic, it fractured into kind of the worst case scenario, right? Of people feeling like they were in camps, the I wear masks camp and the I don't wear masks camp and the they won't get vaccinated camp and the they are, trying to take my freedoms camp. And everyone is turning on each other and feeling persecuted by each other. And that's the worst you can have.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was hard for adults, let alone teens, because everyone can probably relate to and remember being a teenager, and your friends are so important to you. They are really, really important. And so for there to be this division or kind of this fraction among your friends, that's really hard, right? And so, and then, you chalk that up with just, we were legitimately isolated. I mean, everyone during the pandemic was forced to isolate. And, logically, you can realize, okay, we're doing this to try to keep people safe, but it doesn't change the reality of I'm stuck at home all day with my family. And there has to have been a lot of teens that had a less than ideal family situation.
Yes.
That makes it incredibly hard. I mean, imagine being a kid who likes going to school just because it got them away from their family. And all of a sudden, you don't have that outlet anymore. And you're just stuck at home with these crummy people you don't even like, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe you just feel like the black sheep of the family, right? Or you feel like you just don't belong with your family. And all of a sudden, you're stuck with them all the time. That's lonely. That's isolating. That's depressing. And you get that sense of hopelessness because, as you said, that underdeveloped prefrontal cortex has such a hard time seeing past what you're in currently. And I remember those feelings as a teenager. I remember going through something and like, this is the end of the world. This feels like the end of the world. This is never going to change. This is my life now, and my life sucks. Right. And it's so hard for teens to pull out of that.
Yes, very much. So isolation, hopelessness, often if you're a suicide researcher, you'll refer to like a lack of belonging. That comes from this sense of like, I don't have a community. I'm not valued. No one would care if I die, right? Those kinds of feelings cluster under this idea of lack of belonging. And then the other thing that's highly associated with having intense suicidal thoughts is feeling like you are a burden on people. feeling like the world would be better off if you were not in it. And so, yes, the phenomenon you're describing of like they're stuck at home, maybe they don't get on well with their parents. I mean, a lot of teenagers don't. That's kind of their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But their parents are under super high stress.
Yeah.
They're scared. They have probably lost income. They may have lost both incomes, right? Like the parents are stressed. There were a much higher reported rate of emotional and physical abuse in homes during the pandemic. And so that sense of like, maybe my family doesn't even want me. Teenagers need to fight with their parents and push back on them, but they also still really need to feel that they are valued and wanted and cared for. And so sometimes parents see that push away and think, okay, they don't need me, or they're such jerks. There's no way that I'm going to, keep putting myself in contact with this person. I'll just leave them alone. Yeah, I get it. Right. Like,
but that doesn't make it the right move. And it's hard. It's so hard to have that parent teenage relationship when there's friction.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just hard. And so let's talk about warning signs then. Right. I mean, because it's very natural to have, kind of this fractured parent teenage relationship. That's very normal. And it's okay that you're not getting along with your teen all the time, right? That's fine. In fact, newsflash, you don't have to be your teen's best friend, right? In fact, if you are your teen's best friend, something's probably wrong. And
them knowing that you care about them, that you love them, even if you don't really like them right now, is different than being their best friend.
Oh, yeah. I always love my kids, but I do not always like my kids. And the same is said with my husband. I love him to pieces. I would do anything for him, but I don't always like that man. And it's okay to not like your family sometimes. That's just fine. Let's talk about warning signs of suicidality in adolescence, because that's very important to know.
I was going to say they do not always give them. They do not always show these signs visibly. So to any parents out there who might be listening, who have had something happen and have that like horrible feeling of, I just had no idea, often they won't, because it's especially hard to see if, your teen comes home from school and they go straight into their room and, they don't come out again for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Or if they're gone doing activities all around the clock and, you don't get that much time with them, because like one of the big warning signs is a marked change in behavior. Giving away prized possessions or seeming not to care about things they've cared about, certainly like other signs of depression that you'd be looking for. But again, some of this is hidden. Like if they're having trouble sleeping, if your teen is not sleeping nearly enough, and a lot of teens aren't, it does increase their risk.
Oh, yeah.
And especially if there's a marked change in that, if they suddenly start sleeping much less or sleeping much more, right? That can also be a sign of depression. If they suddenly stop going to classes, change in behavior like that, or stop seeing their friends,
Okay. Yeah.
So verbalizations, of course, if you're hearing anything that touches on those themes of hopelessness, that they feel hopeless about the future, burdensomeness, that they feel like, the world would be better off without them, or isolation, that they feel like they do not belong anywhere, right? That deserves, more investigation. A lot of times, though, who will have some awareness of this are their friends on social media or their friends at school, right? Their
peers.
Their peers. So that kind of brings up an interesting point that I usually talk to parents about separately. But when it comes to social media and communication with friends, I have kind of what some people think is a very radical stance. But I believe that parents do their kids a benefit if they make it clear when they get that phone or when they get that social media account that the parent will be looking at it from time to time. Yeah. That won't.
Yeah.
And so the main reason I advocate that is prevents your child from getting sucked into the false sense that they have any privacy online, right? You want to prevent some of the behaviors that come from believing they have privacy in those communications. But then a side benefit is that you would be getting to see their communications where they may be reaching out to a friend, saying, I've been cutting myself, or saying, I don't think I can go on anymore, right? Things that they might not say in front of their parents.
Yeah. So one thing that you've said before that I 100% agree with is for the sake of anyone's mental health, limit your use of social media.
Yes.
And that is especially true with teens. We've done an entire episode on teens, tweens, and social media, right? And just cell phones and the dangers of the internet. And those are things that parents really, really need to be aware of and to pay attention to. And I also like the idea of, and this is, I think, something that your dad has said before, that kids do not need a cell phone. You can give them a cell phone to use, but the best thing you can do is say, this is my cell phone. I'm allowing you to use it, which means I have unlimited access to it.
Exactly.
I can see everything on it, and I will be regularly monitoring it. And that can go a long way in helping. And the other thing I think that parents can do is if they notice these behaviors, or if maybe their teen just, I don't know, tends towards being kind of an isolationist, because some teenagers just do. And sometimes they do it just for no reason at all. Right. I mean, sometimes there's nothing going on and they just kind of isolate themselves. And that can be normal. But I think the best thing that you can do as a parent is just to reassure them that you care. Even if you think they're not listening to you, or if they're just ignoring you, you have to keep saying it anyways. You have to keep saying, I love you. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're with us. I'm glad that I get to be your parent. Those are so important to keep saying to your teens, no matter how many times they push you away. And no matter how disresponsive they seem to be to you, say it anyways.
Yeah. And if you're worried, ask.
Yeah.
It feels so good to people generally to be asked.
Yeah.
Especially if you can listen with a somewhat open mind. Because if you can ask, like, have you been having any thoughts about killing yourself? Even if you don't have any concerns, really, I encourage people to have these conversations. I know that a lot of your peers might talk about killing themselves. They might talk about cutting themselves. Like, are those things that you've struggled with? You can say that at any time, because I guarantee you it's true for every single one of your teenagers. Like, they have peers who, are talking about this stuff, who are seriously depressed, who are struggling with other mental health concerns, who have eating disorders, who are self-injuring. This is their peer group now. And so you can just, bring it up out of the blue. You never increase suicidality by asking about it. That's just not how it works. Talking about it doesn't plant the idea. And as long as you can stay a little bit open and receptive, because what you wouldn't want to have happen is you say to your teen, hey, have you been thinking about killing yourself? And your teen says, well, yeah, I do have those thoughts. And you freak out, right? And you tighten up. You're like, oh, okay, all right. We need a therapist for you right now. Like, just kind of a like, oh no, you've said something not okay, right? Like, hopefully what you would say then is, I am so sorry to hear that. Can I ask you some more questions about that? Right? So you're making it clear, this is a dialogue. As heavy as it is, what you've just said, as much as that's hard for me, I'm going to talk with you more about it, right? I'm not going to shut down. I'm not going to freak out, but I want to know more. I want to know, for example, like, are those thoughts you have pretty much every day or just once in a while? Are those thoughts that are sort of just passing? Like, maybe I wish I were dead, or it'd be easier if I were dead. Or are those thoughts that get really serious? Like, I have a plan of how I would kill myself. Or maybe like, I'm thinking about a time when I would do it, or maybe, have you ever actually gone through part of an attempt? Because a lot of times parents won't know. I probably just said the scariest thing ever, right? That, that adolescent girls, especially, right, who are more likely to use overdose as their method. It's not uncommon for me to learn one of my clients has had several attempts involving overdose of medication, and the parents have not had any idea.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think one important thing that I'm hearing you stress is when a teen does admit this, or when someone admits that they're dealing with suicidal ideation, as a parent, you need to make it known that you can handle this.
Yeah.
I can handle this burden. I want to help you bear this burden. I want to go through this with you and try to help alleviate this pain that you're feeling. And if you immediately start saying things like, no, no, please don't do that. Please don't kill yourself. I love you. I don't want you to die. You're
Yeah.
making it about you. And that's
Yes.
not helpful. You need to keep the focus on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you need to be calm, and you need to make this an idea that you can cope with, because if you can't cope with it, it's going to make it that much harder for your teen to cope with.
Exactly. They're scared, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so as hard as it is, because you are scared as a parent when you hear your kid say this, try and breathe through. Know that you are going to have a chance to talk to your spouse, your friend, your therapist, right? You are going to have a chance to get help for yourself.
Yeah.
But right now, the priority is letting them know that they can talk to you, that you take it very seriously.
Yes.
Right. But that you also understand, in those questions I ask, there's this implicit understanding that when someone says, yes, I've been thinking about suicide, that could mean a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah.
It was half of college students who said they'd had some thoughts about dying. Some thoughts about wanting to be dead, what we would call passive ideations that aren't even really suicidal ideations. They're just like, I wish I were dead. I wish I weren't here anymore, right? We don't even consider those suicidal thoughts, but they can be scary sounding to someone who maybe doesn't talk about this very often.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've talked about this before, that one thing that separates us from animals is the fact that we can contemplate our own death, and that kind of scares people, but it's actually normal to think about death. It's normal to think about dying. It doesn't necessarily make you suicidal. And so I think that is an important differentiation to make. And it's especially probably normal if someone they know has just gone, or someone they know who's completed suicide. If someone in their circle has completed suicide, they're probably going to be thinking a lot about it. And I think that's one thing that we haven't quite touched on yet that we need to, is the phenomenon of when suicide happens in a community, it makes it much more likely that more teens will complete or attempt suicide. And so that is something that is so important to talk about. If there's been a suicide in your community, you need to talk to your teen or your adolescent about it. You have to talk about it and start paying attention to those kinds of things.
Especially if they knew the person.
Yes.
Right? If you know someone who has died by suicide, for an adolescent, it does increase that risk. Not a lot. I wouldn't go so far as to say that's really common, right?
Okay. Yeah.
In fact, those kinds of clusters are relatively rare. And so people, of course, want to study them and want to find out what's happening. And sometimes what you find out is sort of like, this is a coincidence. Like, these aren't related events. This just happens to be a high school with 10,000 people. And, and so the more typical thing is not that then other people also kill themselves.
Right.
But certainly take that opportunity to talk to your teen about it.
Yeah.
And if they were close to the person, to set them up with some grief counseling. Where they can have a space to process their feelings about that. And yes, they are likely to be having more suicidal thoughts about it. And, overall, the more secrecy and the more stigma, the more shame there is about these topics, the worse the problem is. Right?
Yeah.
And so you do also get, more suicidality in sort of places and cultures where there's sort of like a pressure to put on a perfect image,
Which is social media.
Social media is all about that.
Yes. Yeah. Social media. I mean, and that's one issue with social media, as that I think a lot of teens fail to see, is you are seeing one snapshot of someone's life, one perfect snapshot that they designed and they planned. You don't see anything else going on in that person's life. You have no context. You only have that one perfect snapshot. That's not reality. And I think teens often forget that. So the last thing I want to bring up before we've got to wrap up is the importance of validation when it comes to suicidality. So many people have this idea, and I get it, that validation means I agree with you, and that it's not the case at all. when it comes to suicidality and adolescents feeling depressed or anxious or all their emotions, validating doesn't mean
you're not condoning, you're not encouraging them to take action. You're just saying, I get you. You're connecting on a deep human level.
Yes. So validate your teen who says that they are suicidal. Even if you say something like, I can see how much pain you're in. I can see that you're in a lot of pain, and, I want to help you. That can go a long way. People who have suicidal ideation, they often feel like no one else is going to get it. And I think all teens feel that way, that no one gets me, no one understands. That's very, very common teenage angst. And so just saying, I see you. I see this intense pain that you're in. Tell me more about it. Or if you don't want to talk to me, tell me who you will talk to, and I'll connect you with them. Anyone that you can talk to about this, let's do it.
Yeah. So Liz, I'd like to say something else just for the parents who might be listening, who don't yet have teenagers.
Yes.
Right? This idea of talking about it, that talking about it is never harmful, that secrecy and shame are harmful, that stigma is harmful. My kids are 6 and 9. Right. So a little incident from our lives, actually just last week, I was driving carpool with a bunch of 6-year-olds. And one of the kids made some comment that was like, oh, I'm going to kill myself. Like, I don't know where he'd heard it. It was a joke, but kids say these things.
Yeah.
Right. It didn't mean anything to him. And in that moment I said, hey, I know you're joking, and I want you to know that that's not funny to me, because that's a real thing. Yeah. And so I talked to a crew of 6-year-olds about the fact that, yes, sometimes people do get so sad that they want to die. And they were fascinated by it. Right. And, I kept it at 6-year-old level, and they were fascinated. Right. They were fascinated by it for like 3 minutes. And then they were talking about Pokemon. Right.
Yep.
But that is suicide prevention. Right. Like just this little bit of, this happens in the world. There has been a longstanding cultural history of, if someone died by suicide, you would never even name it. And we would, you had that uncle that died, and we don't talk about him, and we don't talk about how he died, because that's so shameful. And also the idea that it might be like poisonous to sort of talk about the idea. Well, that's not true at all.
Yeah. We going to talk about Bruno.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Yep. So when it comes to this, we're going to talk about it. That doesn't glamorize it. That doesn't make it more likely to happen. It just means it's more likely that when your kids do get to that point where either they know somebody who is seriously considering suicide, or they themselves are, because I guarantee you, every single one of your adolescents is going to have one of those experiences.
Yeah.
That hopefully then they will know that they can talk about it to you.
Or anyone, or that they can, that it's okay to talk about it. And, tell your teen, it's okay that you feel this hurt. It's okay that you feel this intense pain. I'm going to help get you through it.
Yes.
Telling them that you're not mad at them. You're not upset. You're certainly not disappointed. You just want to help them in whatever way you can. So I do also want to reference an episode that I think is important for all parents to, I guess, be thinking about. So it was an episode that Mark and I did back in October of 21, and it's called Building Positive Relationships with Teens. And a lot of that starts early on. So it's definitely worth listening, because if you can build a positive relationship or have that positive relationship with your teen, it's going to make it so much easier. All right. Thank you again, Adryon, for joining us this week. This has been a really important conversation that I think we can have. Next week, we're going to be back with Dr. Mark Burton. And this also brings us to the end of Suicide Awareness Month. So we're going to get into divorce next week and get into a little bit of a listener story. So thanks again, Adryon, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.